Good morning, and welcome back to Sociology Deviance Notes. I consider this to be week a billion, but I think it is actually week 8. So let's get into the end of this deviance unit, types of crime. Yes. So this is a slide from last week. It says that norms are generally reflected um, with the interests of the powerful and rich, and that powerful have the resources to resist deviant labeling, and that laws are inherently unfair. So we're going to be talking about these when we talk about types of crime, and we're going to be talking about sentencing and criminal behavior and what happens if you are convicted of a crime if you are wealthy. So there's been a lot more about this in the news recently with the college admissions scandal. There was, some things about insider trading, tax fraud, those kinds of things. And a lot of times those are classified differently when we look at criminal behavior and are treated more leniently because they are committed by people who are typically wealthy. So let's do it. All right, so Spitzer said that deviant labels are applied to those who impede the operation of capitalism. So if you're doing something that interferes with the capitalist system, you're more likely to receive a more harsh deviant label or a stigma, as we now know from last week. And those who are, aiding the flow of capitalism are considered lesser criminals and typically are able to shed those deviant labels quite quickly. And we'll be talking about that when we talk about these different types of crime. All right. So white collar crimes are typically committed by somebody who's in a high social position, and it's typically a civil crime rather than a criminal crime. So this would be our college admissions scandal, where people who have money are using their high social position and their money itself to commit an illegal act. And usually these people are not given the same punishments as a criminal crime. And just a reminder that drug offenses are considered criminal acts. They are not civil acts. They have mandatory minimum sentencing, and they're considered when you go into prison as, like, in a lot of places, similar to that of somebody who committed much harsh crimes. So they have the same sentencing guidelines. So white collar crimes usually have really lenient sentencing. Usually it's, you know, 14 days in prison and then 3 months probation, kind of like a don't do it again. Or sometimes these people are just placed under house arrest. So it's, these white collar crimes are committed by people who are using their power to kind of not go to jail. Or sometimes these people, because it's a civil crime, are hit with heavy fines. So they just want your money. Corporate crime is an illegal action on the behalf of a corporation or people acting on its behalf. So this would be like your Ponzi schemes, your Robert Madoff, your illegal businesses that are not gang related. So illegal like corporate crime would be like Enron, which was this scheme where people who worked for this company basically gambled away all of the pension funds. And then those people who were retired, who lost all their money, they were kind of left high and dry. So people were like taking the corporation's retirement money and then reinvesting it on their own behalf, making money off of it and like draining the corporation. But they were doing it as a unit. So they are typically crimes that flow with capitalism, enter the capitalistic market, but are committed by a group of people and are typically on behalf of the business and has to be a legit business. All right, so this is not legit business, organized crime. So these are people who are impeding that flow of capitalism. It is buying or supplying illegal goods or services. So, drug sales, sale of illegal weapons, prostitution, that kind of stuff would be organized crime. Um, that is usually larger scale than just a few people. Um, there could be violence at any point in any of this, just so you know, but we're just specifically, we're not talking about like gangs going and killing people. We're talking about gangs just providing illegal services. So it's like I said, it's organized. It's more than just a couple of people, but they are impeding capitalism because the business is not legit. All right, hate crimes. Hate crimes are criminal acts carried out by a person or on a person's property by an offender motivated by racial or other biases. So hate crimes would be, obviously if you're killing or beating somebody, but it can also be as simple as vandalizing somebody's property using hate symbols. And these crimes are usually punishable by, obviously depending on the degree of the crime, prison, it could be probation, and things like that. They are typically not finable offenses. They usually have a specific consequence, and like I said, are motivated by race or other bias, such as gender bias or, orientation bias, things like that. When we look at crime, there are several components to these different types of crime. There's the crime itself, and then there's the mens rea, which means that there's the criminal intent. So you can also be charged for intending to commit a crime, plotting and planning a crime, suspicion of committing a crime. So it's more than just the act itself, but all of the work that goes behind the scenes before the crime is actually committed. And if you're plotting a crime, like say if you're plotting a murder, you can actually be charged before the murder is committed. Typically, the sentence is not as long, depending on what the plot and plan is. But, the intent to do something a lot of times can be, just as stigmatizing, devastating, put you in prison just as long than the actual crime. When we look at crime, beyond the different classifications of white collar, corporate, organized, and hate, there is also different types of crime. There's crime against a person, which would be a direct violence. There is crime against property, which would be like theft, arson, vandalism, that kind of stuff, where like property of somebody is getting damaged. And then there are victimless crimes, where you violate the law, but there's no intended victim. A victimless crime would be speeding on the highway. It's like you don't intend by speeding to endanger other drivers. However, you could accidentally, drunk driving is another one of those. Sorry, I gave you two car references, but it's what's on my mind this morning, getting in the car. So we have to know that crime rates actually rose from 1960 to 1990, but have been on a steady decline ever since. And the idea that there's this huge like crime problem is actually made up, that through the 1990s, 2000s, and even the 2010s. So really the last 30 years, the crime rate has dropped dramatically in comparison to what it was, say, in the 1950s. And part of that has to do with increased surveillance, police officers, and things like that. But I mean, the idea that the crime problem is out of control is, like I said, it's kind of over exaggerated. There's this really high emphasis on economic success and private gun ownership. And a lot of sociologists point to those different, the inability to share the wealth and the fact that people feel really possessive about their firearms is part of the reason why we have so much crime and criminal behavior in the United States. If there was more equality in our capitalist system, then people wouldn't have to commit illegal acts because there'd be room for everybody to achieve wealth. One of the greatest detrimental issues or like events that happened in the most modern history is the 2008 recession, which actually increased the number of poor people, averaging around like 9 to 10% across the entire United States, and helped grow the gap between the 1% and the rest of the United States population. So when we look at the criminal justice system, there's some process as part of it. It is called due process. So if you look in our Constitution, it has a laid out form for what due process is. And we know that once you get arrested, if you've ever seen the show Cops, they're reading your Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in the court of law. You have the right to an attorney, etc., etc., etc. If you're charged of a crime, you must be given fair notice so that way you can arrange to have a meeting with your defense. You must be told what your charges are, which is what is displayed at your hearing, and you have to have either a judge or jury weigh that evidence impartially. Most criminal cases in the United States, and civil cases too for that matter, are actually presented primarily before a judge. I know that some of you guys will get called to jury duty. I've been called to jury duty, and you think of what you see on television as being a jury trial and how there must be thousands and thousands of them every single day in every single court case across the courtroom across the country. But honestly, it's really not that busy. Just a few cases a day are heard in each courtroom, and a lot of the cases are worked out, just with the judge. So this is a piece of controversial information where police, are the people who are doing the arresting and how they have to assess what's going on when they first come to the scene. So here are some questions that are asked at the primary point of contact. So, there's some demographic information there, some information regarding who made the call, what their preferences are. Has the person been arrested before? Are there people to interview, bystanders, etc. When entering the court, there's sometimes an option for a plea bargain where you reduce a charge in exchange for a guilty plea. This is a lot of times used if there's a public defender. So sometimes people sit in jail for a while before they have their case because they can't make bail. And a lot of times, if you take a guilty plea, even though it ends up on your record, you end up getting out of prison earlier, opposed to sitting in prison, going through the whole trial with the option of potentially being charged as guilty. So, 60 Minutes did a story on this a few years ago. If we were in class, we'd probably watch it about how courts essentially trick people into taking guilty pleas, and then they end up with this stigmatizing label, unable to get housing, jobs, etc. So here's some types of punishment. There's retribution, which is moral vengeance. So if you're going to go out and receive retribution, that's really what they're talking about as the criminal doing. There's deterrence, where you're served as an example. So you may be put in prison or, put on display doing community service. Rehab is when you're giving state money to go to a rehabilitation facility. So if you're like an addict and you're selling drugs, then they rehab you instead of putting you in prison because it's actually more effective. And then there's societal protection, which is just going to jail. One of the last slides here. So community-based corrections involve probation. So probation was introduced to reduce overcrowding in prisons and to get people back in the communities and back on their feet with the guidance of a probation officer. So probation is something that you're given in lieu of going to jail. You just go and you meet with your probation officer, you do drug tests, check-ins, that kind of stuff. Shock probation is when you go to jail for a period of time. Usually it's less than 6 months, and then you go on probation. It's again to reduce prison populations and is typically reserved for civil crimes. Parole or nonviolent crimes like drug offenses and things like that. Parole is when you release an inmate to serve the remainder of their sentence in probation type setting in the community. So if you do good things, you're in good behavior, you can go up for parole after a set amount of time, represent your information, show what you've done to fix your behavior, your mood, your attitude, your actions, and then they release you. Oh, and that's the end. That's the end of Deviance.